Keir Starmer is running scared of Nigel Farage. His speech at the Scottish Labour Party conference this morning proves it.
A dangerous right-wing politics, even here in Scotland, that will say they are the ones who can tilt politics towards the interests of working people.
Keir Starmer is getting more and more desperate by the day as Labour is getting crushed by Reform UK.
Well, I have to say, Peter, I laughed as I sort of spat out my cornflakes this morning as he made that ridiculous speech. I mean, honestly, what it shows is that he and the Labour Party are terrified and petrified.
Nigel Farage and Reform, on the other hand, aren't worried about Starmer and his lying cronies in the least.
Ministers had to stop looking down on people then who are worried about immigration, which is a message that he needs to get out to the public to have any chance whatsoever of winning back people from Reform.
Labour's shambolic disasters are coming back to haunt them as the public is demanding absolute accountability.
Sir Keir Starmer has taken the fight to reform as he's warned his cabinet that Labour must stop looking down at working class voters and take their worries about immigration seriously. Slightly worrying that he feels like he has to actually articulate that, but hey, we'll go with it for now.
After getting slapped with brutal reality checks, the tone-deaf Starmer is finally snapping out of his delusions.
Are they talking the talk and walking the walk, or is it just talk?
It shows to me that the team around Keir Starmer and himself are listening, I think, to the concerns of GB News viewers and listeners. The 1,500-word letter to the members of the Labour cabinet from Sir Keir Starmer sent in the past 7 days. In there, he says in terms that we must recognise that all immigration is not an untrammelled good.
Insecure Starmer and the terrified Labour Party are on the brink of destruction, so they're desperately trying to fix things.
I think it's astonishing that any politician in this country needs to hear that, you know, the working class's opinions are to be taken seriously, but that we are entitled to them, and I'm including myself in that one as well. But, so this was a letter that was sent out to every Labour Party member?
No, the cabinet.
Could Labour be abandoning their sinister and disgusting socialist agenda, or are they lying to the public again?
It's him telling his top leadership team, take immigration seriously, don't patronise people who are concerned about it. He says here, the establishment has ignored working people on immigration, he says, and that created a schism in our politics. He says we need to stop looking down on people who are worried about immigration. What started with good faith paternalism, he says, has too readily become looking down at people.
Yeah.
The immigration crisis has brought Britain to its knees, and if Starmer continues to make it worse, he'll be booted out of office.
You can't say anything about immigration because you are racist. That's coming from a lot of the people in that cabinet.
We get that a lot at GB News. We talk about immigration, illegal and legal migration as a big issue. We know it's a big issue from our postbag, and then critics say it's a racist thing to talk about, and it just isn't. And understanding that, I think Sir Keir Starmer is going towards understanding that. He also talks about the rivals to Labour.
Starmer and his cronies have poisoned British politics in the most disgusting and shameless manner possible.
At Reform UK and to a lesser extent the Tory party, to taking on immigration first of all, that is certainly an attack on Reform, who go on about it a lot. And he's saying we can also own this too in Labour. He also says that this new era, he used the word new era 5 times in this letter, doesn't have to be defined by those who want to charge people to use the NHS. That has been mooted in the past, or flat by Reform, I think, a flat taxation system. That's been mooted maybe by Kemi Babe, not that hand tax cuts to millionaires.
Unoriginal and stuttering Starmer is trying to copy Nigel Farage, and the entire world is laughing at him.
Kemi Babe, he's saying if we don't take on these issues, our rivals benefit. I mean, and just finally, he does say at the very end, he wants to stand up for ordinary people who feel shut out and ignored by elites. So he's taking on the establishment on behalf of the working people.
Labour is on the brink of collapse, and unless they turn things around by some miracle, they're finished.
But, I mean, how has this gone down with the cabinet? I mean, you know, the likes of Yvette Cooper infamously, you know, stand there, refugees welcome and migrants welcome, whatever it was, but everyone was welcome, yeah.
We don't know yet. We haven't got reaction from the cabinet. They probably wouldn't comment on a leaked letter.
No, of course they're not, but I'm wondering if they're thinking it's, well...
I think the fact it needs to be said says something. The fact that people need to be told that, you know, we need to recognise that concerns about migration, don't look down on people who have those concerns. They aren't racist.
Just what is Reform UK doing that's left Starmer and his gang of idiots shivering? The answer is simple: treating the British public as a priority.
Good to see you. You are under fire from Keir Starmer today. I'm sure you're very, very worried about that. Quaking in your boots, no doubt. Let's just remind ourselves of what Keir Starmer said at the Scottish Labour Party conference earlier today.
If we don't show a path to the future, others will fill that void. In fact, they already are. A dangerous right-wing politics, even here in Scotland, that will say they are the ones who can tilt politics towards the interests of working people.
Keir Starmer is running scared. Reform UK is gaining momentum and Labour knows it. That's why Starmer is resorting to tired fear-mongering, calling reform dangerous at the Scottish Labour conference. But what's truly dangerous? Labour's obsession with controlling speech, hiking taxes, and crushing the working class under more government overreach. Starmer doesn't want people to have an alternative, he wants total domination. Reform is surging because it actually listens to the British people while Labour sneers at them. Starmer's attack isn't just desperate, it's proof he sees the British public slipping from his grip.
You want to know what Farage and Reform are doing on their rare visits to Parliament? They're voting against our Employment Rights Bill. They talk the language of workers' rights online and on the doorstep, but they voted against banning fire and rehire. They voted against scrapping exploitative zero-hour contracts.
Starmer is lying through his teeth again. He claims Reform UK is anti-worker, but who really hurts working people? Labour, with its obsession over nanny state policies and high taxes that punish small businesses. Reform is standing up for hard-working Brits by opposing laws that make it harder for employers to hire. Labour pretends to care about workers, but all they do is increase dependency on government handouts. Starmer doesn't want prosperity, he wants control. His attack on Reform UK is just another attempt to shut down real opposition and keep British workers under Labour's thumb.
Well, I have to say, Peter, I laughed as I sort of spat out my cornflakes this morning as he made that ridiculous speech. I mean, honestly, what it shows is that he and the Labour Party are terrified and petrified of the progress of reform, not just across the whole of the UK, where we're now leading in many of the opinion polls, but also in Scotland, where we've been soaring in the polls as well.
Reform UK is rising and Starmer is losing his mind over it. The fact that he's even mentioning reform at all shows how much Labour fears them. While reform climbs in the polls, Labour is tanking, especially in Scotland. Why? Because people are sick of Starmer's out-of-touch elitist nonsense. Reform stands for common sense, real solutions, and giving working-class Brits a fair shot. Starmer, he stands for bureaucracy, virtue signalling, and more of the same failures that have plagued Britain for decades. His attack on reform is nothing more than a sign of desperation.
And that's because actually, we're standing up for decent, ordinary working folk. We've got the policies of common sense that many of your listeners have been reporting to you today. And it's interesting now, the Prime Minister is so desperate, Peter, that he's resorting essentially to telling blatant lies. And let me just run through a few of them for you. First of all, in terms of appearing in the House of Commons, I'm in the top 10 backbenchers for speaking.
Now, Starmer is flat out lying about Reform UK, claiming they're absent from Parliament. In reality, Reform MPs speak more than most Labour backbenchers combined. And let's not forget, where is Starmer's own leadership? Labour is in shambles and he's too busy smearing political opponents to offer real solutions. Meanwhile, he attacks Nigel Farage for engaging internationally, as if speaking to global leaders is a crime. The real question is, why is Starmer so threatened? Because he knows reform speaks for the people, while Labour keeps pushing failed, tired policies no one wants anymore.
The next lie that the Prime Minister told was with regard to the NHS. We've never suggested charging people, far from it. We keep repeating, free at the point of delivery. What we've done, and what Health Secretary Wes Streeting did, was to copy our policies of saying, actually, in order to bring the waiting list down and improve healthcare for everybody, you've got to make greater use of the independent sector. The NHS should be buying millions of operations from the independent sector to get waiting lists down.
Labour is even lying about the NHS now. Starmer and his cronies claim Reform wants to privatise healthcare, but that's pure fiction. Reform supports an NHS that's free at the point of use while making it more efficient, something Labour refuses to do. Instead, Starmer and his failed Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, are the ones copying Reform's policies on using the private sector to reduce waiting lists. Labour isn't about solutions, they're about fear-mongering. Starmer can't stand that Reform actually has a plan, so he resorts to his usual strategy, smearing, lying, and hoping no one notices.
So what is, just, we'll get to the next bit in a second, so what would Reform do for working people? What would you do differently to what the government is doing now?
The key thing is you've got to make it easier for businesses to employ people, not by lifting the national insurance, not by making it more expensive. What we want to do is to make work pay, which is why our key economic policy is to lift the starting point at which you pay any income tax whatsoever to £20,000 from £12,500. That's a massive difference to help people get off benefits back into work.
Reform UK is offering a real economic plan, something Labour refuses to do. While Starmer and his tax-hungry party want to take more of your hard-earned money, Reform is fighting to make work pay. Raising the tax-free threshold to £20,000 would be life-changing for millions, but Labour, they'd rather keep people trapped in high-tax, low-opportunity misery. Starmer wants Brits reliant on government scraps instead of thriving in a booming economy. That's why he's panicking, because Reform is offering common-sense policies that actually empower working people. And that's the last thing Labour wants.
Has seen a private letter that Sir Keir Starmer has reportedly sent to his cabinet saying that Labour must stop looking down on people who are worried about immigration. Does this mean the PM is taking the fight to reform, and can he appeal to those voters? Let's just have a look at this letter, guys, and the bits that we've seen from it. He says ministers had to stop looking down on people then who are worried about immigration.
Keir Starmer is panicking. A leaked letter shows he's suddenly telling his ministers to stop looking down on voters concerned about immigration. Why? Because Reform is ahead, and he knows Labour's betrayal of the working class is catching up with them. For years, Labour has dismissed these concerns as bigotry, but now that they're bleeding voters, Starmer wants to pretend he understands. It's laughable. This is nothing but an election stunt. Labour will go right back to mass migration and open borders the moment they get power. Brits aren't fooled by Starmer's desperate attempts to save face.
For politics today right across Western Europe, the United Kingdom and the United States is immigration. You know, it, as Suella Braverman said a couple of years ago, many people have reiterated since then, including obviously myself and most recently JD, I think you have to say Vance is the right way to pronounce it.
As opposed to Vance.
As opposed to Vance, yeah. Oh, I just think JD Vance, but anyway. And JD Vance said it was the seminal issue that, you know, we need to deal with. So immigration is right up there. And
immigration is the defining issue of our time, yet Labour refuses to admit it. Conservatives, Reform, and even leaders abroad recognise that uncontrolled migration is tearing apart national identity, overloading public services, and driving wages down. But Labour, they push mass immigration under the guise of diversity, ignoring the damage done to British workers. Starmer and his elitist friends want open borders, while working-class Brits struggle to find jobs, housing, and healthcare. The fact that Reform is rising proves that people are fed up. Starmer can't fake caring about immigration when Labour has been its biggest enabler.
But any form of immigration is an admission that you can't deal with issues in your own country on your own. When you take foreign people into your country, you should only do it if there's a need for your country to have those foreigners. In other words, you can't fill the need from within. And what we've done is there's been some ideological hijacking of the British governing class over the last 30 or 40 years in particular, where they've seen the taking on of vast quantities of foreign people into our country and then wrapping them in a protected blanket and allowing multicultural silos to exist.
Starmer and Labour have spent decades pushing mass migration while pretending it benefits Britain. In reality, uncontrolled immigration is an admission of failure, a government too incompetent to train and employ its own people. But Labour doesn't care. Instead, they've hijacked British politics with woke ideology, flooding the country with mass migration while shielding migrants from criticism. Meanwhile, British workers are left behind, wages are squeezed, and communities are fractured. Starmer's sudden concern is pure political theatre. He and Labour will always put foreign interest before British citizens. It's their ideology, and it's why reform continues to gain momentum.
And what we've done in the process is undermine our workforce, put undue burden on our public services, break the settled culture that the United Kingdom used to have, and create division right across society. And by the way, that doesn't make sense, what I've just said, division across society, because society requires a settled, integrated culture, and we don't have one. We've broken our society.
Labour has spent years championing mass immigration as some kind of progress, but what has it really brought? Chaos. Wages driven down, public services stretched to the breaking point, and entire communities left unrecognizable. Starmer now pretends to care, but only because voters are waking up to the disaster Labour has caused. If he truly believed in fixing this mess, he'd admit that Labour's policies have failed spectacularly, but he won't, because Labour benefits from division. They want a fragmented Britain where different groups are dependent on the state, ensuring Labour stays in power. Reform is calling this out.
And I think it's sent the shockwaves through that sort of centre ground, if you like, of which the British Labour Party is part. And I think it is a recognition that that sense of we know best, we have ignored the genuine concerns of people. So, you know, it's fine, but you can't keep, you know, personally, I don't think, I know Ben would disagree because he always bangs on about it, but I don't think immigration is number one priority. I think the economy is the number one priority.
They go hand in hand.
Well, they may well do.
Labour has ignored the working class for years, looking down on them while pushing policies that destroy their livelihoods. Now, Starmer is scrambling to regain trust, but it's too late. The real divide isn't between left and right, it's between the elite and the people. Labour's arrogance, telling Brits they're wrong to worry about mass immigration, has backfired. They can't mock voters for years and then beg for their support when reform surges ahead. Brits are rejecting Labour's failures, and Starmer knows it. That's why he's panicking, but no amount of rebranding will erase Labour's betrayal of the people.
There are 7.2 million people on universal credit, and they wouldn't be there if it wasn't for unbridled, virtually unskilled immigration.
It is inevitable on an island that you are going to have people from different countries and different parts of the world coming.
Labour loves to act like they care about the cost of living crisis, but who's really responsible? Years of unbridled, low-skilled immigration, crushing wages and overloading welfare. There are 7.2 million people on universal credit, many struggling because Labour's policies have flooded the job market, making it impossible for Brits to get ahead. Starmer wants to pretend immigration isn't a problem, but it's directly tied to economic hardship. Reform understands this, but Labour ignores it because they rely on mass migration for votes and cheap labour. Brits are paying the price, and no amount of Labour spin can change that reality.
Keir Starmer is running scared of Nigel Farage. His speech at the Scottish Labour Party conference this morning proves it.
A dangerous right-wing politics, even here in Scotland, that will say they are the ones who can tilt politics towards the interests of working people. They claim to be the party of patriotism, but they're fawning over Putin. No, they are not the answer for working people in Britain.
And you think you are? He doesn't get it, does he?
A Keir Starmer is terrified of Nigel Farage, and his speech at the Scottish Labour Party conference proves it. Instead of offering solutions, he resorts to cheap attacks, branding Reform UK dangerous while claiming Labour stands for working Brits. Reality check. Starmer is the one selling Britain out, peddling a failing green agenda and globalist nonsense. He thinks the public is too stupid to see through his lies. Newsflash, voters know exactly what's happening. Labour is a party of elitists, pushing ruinous policies while pretending to be patriotic. Meanwhile, Reform is surging ahead because they actually put Britain first.
He thinks that we will blindly follow Nigel Farage, but we're not stupid. What an insult to our intelligence. In my view, he's just jealous because of this.
The leader of the UK Reform Party, who, by the way, did really well in that last election. I've been his friend for a long time, and I wasn't sure, am I supposed to be his friend or not? But it never mattered to me if he did well or not. I always liked him, but it's easier to like him when he got the kind of votes he got. He really took it by storm, and they say he's going to do even better this time. Nigel Farage. Where is Nigel?
Starmer thinks he can mock the British people, insulting their intelligence by claiming they'll blindly follow Nigel Farage. But it's Labour that expects blind loyalty, while bankrupting the country with fantasy green jobs. Starmer's bitter because Trump praised Farage, calling him a great guy and recognizing his massive electoral success. Farage is rising because he speaks for real Brits, while Labour sneers at them. People are tired of being told what to think by clueless elites like Starmer. Reform isn't about empty slogans, it's about real solutions, and that's why they're gaining ground while Labour panics.
Nigel Farage responded to the Prime Minister saying, "How dare Starmer talk to us about jobs? Scotland has lost more than 70,000 jobs linked to the North Sea as a result of government net zero policies over the past decade." Let me explain this to you, Keir. In really simple terms, without evading the answer by waffling like your lot. Reform UK are ahead of all of you, and that includes the other parties, because you don't listen. You probably won't listen to this, even though I'm actually trying to help you.
How dare Starmer lecture anyone on jobs when Labour's net zero madness has destroyed 70,000 livelihoods in Scotland alone? He waffles on about green energy, but people see through the scam. Working class Brits are struggling under Labour's policies, while Starmer and his lot ignore them. Reform UK, on the other hand, listens. That's why they're overtaking Labour in the polls, because voters are sick of a government that prioritises virtue signalling over real issues. Starmer won't even acknowledge the damage his party is doing because he's too busy smearing the opposition instead of fixing the mess he's creating.
You're not listening to the people who voted for you. You are hooked on your own ideology, which is incompatible with the real world. Take net zero. We can't afford it, and it doesn't make any sense. Hard-working people who you claim to be helping can't afford heat pumps, electric cars and solar panels, and they definitely can't afford it with the tax burden that you are placing on them.
Labour is completely detached from reality. Starmer and his eco-zealots demand net zero, but they don't care that ordinary Brits can't afford it. Heat pumps, solar panels, electric cars? All ridiculously expensive, yet Starmer keeps raising taxes to fund this green pipe dream. The only ones benefiting? His wealthy cronies, like Dale Vince, who profit off these useless schemes. People don't want imaginary future jobs while they struggle today. Labour claims to be for workers, yet they make life harder at every turn. Reform UK gets it, that's why they're leading, while Labour sinks under the weight of its own delusions.
You and your front bench with freebies, Jazz Athwell, Louise Haigh, Tulip Sadiq, Andrew Gwynn, Rachel Reeves and Jonathan Reynolds. It's only been 7 months, God help us. The Tories were too busy tearing themselves apart from the inside out to even hear, so they didn't listen either. They were too self-obsessed, so we ejected them, handing your party a massive parliamentary majority. But here you are, making the same mistake, and so soon on in your term. The majority has gone to your heads, and you're even more tone-deaf to the pensioners, the farmers, your junior minister claiming he's only meeting them to say that he's met them. The arrogance.
7 months of Starmer's Labour, and it's already a disaster. His front bench is filled with freeloaders like Rachel Reeves and Jonathan Reynolds, while their arrogance grows by the day. The Tories collapsed because they ignored the people, and now Labour is doing the exact same thing. Farmers, pensioners, businesses, Labour doesn't care about any of them. They're too busy virtue signalling and making backroom deals like their disgraceful betrayal over the Chagos Islands. Even our closest allies, like the US, are watching in disbelief. Reform UK is rising because people are done with Labour's elitist, self-serving nonsense.
And the latest polling shows that Reform are now ahead of Labour. Sir Keir Starmer's party are sitting at 25% compared to Nigel Farage's party, who are on 27%. Here, in your first few months, despite the country going to hell in a handcart, you were globetrotting. Instead of focusing your energy on what Nigel Farage is saying, why don't you just focus on doing a good job for the country by listening to what the people who pay your wages, not that you need the money.
Reform UK is pulling ahead in the polls, with 27% support, surpassing even Labour. And what is Starmer doing? Jet-setting around the world instead of fixing Britain's problems. He's more obsessed with Nigel Farage than actually running the country. Maybe if he focused on governing instead of smearing reform, Britain wouldn't be in free fall. Labour is failing. Brits know it, and the numbers prove it. The bottom line is simple. Starmer and his lot of Labour idiots are terrified because the public isn't buying their nonsense anymore. Reform and old school conservatives are soaring, and you can show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel.